Welcome to the Company of Dads podcast, where we explore the sweet, silly, strange, and sublime aspects of being a lead dad in a world where men, who are the go-to parent, aren't always accepted at work, among their friends, or in the community for what they're doing. I'm your host, Paul Sullivan. Our podcast is just one of the many things we produce each week at the Company of Dads. We have various features, including the Lead Dad of the Week. We have our community, online and in person. We have a new resource library for all fathers. The one-stop shop for all of this is our newsletter, The Dad. So sign up at thecompanyofdads.com/thedad. Today, my guest is Reshma Saujani, an amazing force for working parents, an advocate for girls, and a thinker on work today. A lawyer by training, she worked in finance, ran for Congress, and served as a deputy public advocate for New York City. But 10 years ago, her career took a turn, and she founded the nonprofit Girls Who Code, which worked to close the tech gap for women by teaching girls to be programmers. In the pandemic, she started a second nonprofit, the Marshall Plan for Moms, now known as Moms First. It advocates for childcare, paid leave, and equal pay for moms. While we at the Company of Dads are focused on lead dads, we know that the majority of them are supporting their own spouses at home and in their careers, and also being advocates for women at work. What Reshma is doing is in line exactly with what we're advocating for. Welcome, Reshma, to the Company of Dads podcast.
Great to be here, Paul. Thank you.
You know, the idea for the Company of Dads came out of the pandemic. I'm quite happy being a New York Times columnist, but I'd always been the lead dad, which we define as the go-to parent, whether he works full-time, part-time, or devotes all of his time to his family. And in many cases, he's supporting his spouse in her career. Now, we know there's some portion of lead dads who are divorced, widowed, or single, but the majority of our constituents are men supporting a partner. You didn't just get the idea for Moms First, formerly known as the Marshall Plans for Moms. You didn't just get the idea in the pandemic. You started it in December, and so people know where you are. You're in New York City. New York City is sort of the epicenter of the pandemic. You're sitting around, all hell is breaking loose. And you're like, you know what? Let's start another nonprofit. Tell me the story. How did it? What was the kernel that led to what's now being called Moms First?
You and I may have had similar epiphanies. I was a mom. I just had a newborn child, and I was already homeschooling my 5-year-old. I was running
so much fun, wasn't it? So much fun. You and the iPad, because you're qualified to do that. So yeah.
While I was trying to do work calls and keep my family alive and do some laundry. And so here I am, have a newborn baby. I am taking care of or homeschooling my, pre-kindergartner. And I'm trying to save my nonprofit, Girls Who Code, which is one of the largest women and girls nonprofits in the world, from being shut down. And it's the pandemic. And there were two things I saw at that moment that I think were eye-openers. One was so many of the students I taught at Girls Who Code were under the poverty line. And their mothers were essential workers. And instead of them going off to college and majoring in computer science, they had to stay home and take care of their siblings because daycare centers were shut down and schools were shut down. And so you really saw how, and because we are the only nation that doesn't have paid leave, right? We have a broken structure of care in our country. And that is actually causing this 2-generational cycle of poverty to happen amongst women. I knew this was happening in other countries, but I didn't know it was happening here. And so seeing that was this light bulb. I could teach millions of girls to code, but if I don't help their mothers, I haven't done anything. And then the second thing was just, again, seeing my own leadership team, which were a lot of working moms of young children, and how, again, we never really had a shot at equality because we were always bogged down by by balancing the unpaid labor that we were doing with the paid labor we're doing. And it was clear that, what was happening in the pandemic didn't start in the pandemic. It's been going on the whole time because the status quo workplaces have never worked for moms. We're the only industrialized nation that doesn't have paid leave. We invest less in childcare than any other nation or industrialized nation. Moms make 58 cents on every dollar earned by dad. 2/3 of the caregiving work is being done by women, and in many ways we're still living in the madman era, in terms of how workplaces are really designed, even though so many mothers today, I think 40% plus, right, are the sole breadwinner or are in, families like yours where the lead parent is a dad. Mm-hmm. So to me, it was very clear that, like, again, like, we're never going to finish the fight for gender equality if we don't finish the fight for moms. And that is what inspired me to step down as CEO of Girls Who Code and start another organization, which was never the plan, because the first one nearly killed me, in building that one. But here I am now, building Moms First to advocate for childcare, paid leave, and pay equity, real structural changes that are necessary to ensure the economic security of women.
One of the things we advocate for at the Company of Dads is sort of parity and fairness in the workplace. If I understand correctly, you're going more at it in a broader, almost systemic way where I get your newsletter, I like it very much, but you're going more the political route. Is that fair to say, and try
I
to
would
push
say
for
we're
change through
doing,
Congress?
no, I would say that what we're really trying to do is focus on changing the private sector first. I as a, failed politician, I don't have a lot of faith um, that Washington is going to get there as quick as it needs to. We just launched a bipartisan childcare caucus with, you know, Nancy Mace and
Yeah.
Ro Khanna. So there are like inklings of support, meaning like if there's ever a moment where childcare could actually be fixed, it's now, because I think whether you're a Republican or a Democrat and you're hearing from your constituents is that the cost of childcare is going up faster than the cost of inflation. It's the largest cost center for families. So many women work to work. So like there needs to be a bipartisan, across the aisle initiative to really bring about change. But while we are, I mean, you just got to look at the debt crisis right now to be like, how quickly is this really going to happen? While I'm like, again, not holding my breath, I think that where there's change that can really happen, I think you'll agree with me, is in the private sector. So at the same time, we've launched about a year ago the National Business Coalition on Childcare, because I believe that companies are incentivized in many ways to fix the broken structure of care, because they too are seeing that so many of their workers are not able to return back to work, or are not able to, leave, have, missed work days,
Mhm.
they're not able to like stay for more than 18 months because childcare is broken. So we have 40 plus companies that have agreed to provide some sort of childcare supports, and start kind of changing the narrative around childcare. That's not it's not a personal problem that you or I have to fix, but an economic imperative. And the next on that list, honestly, is also gender neutral paid leave. I'm sure you're not surprised at how many well-known companies still don't offer gender neutral paid leave. And what I mean by that is they offer moms 12 weeks and they offer dads 4 weeks. Well, what message are we sending then?
Well, I
Right?
think even more that they could offer exactly the same amount, but if they don't have senior executives in the firm modeling that behavior, the junior executive is never going to take 4 weeks, 12 weeks, 20 weeks.
Absolutely. And we know very prominent CEOs kind of march around the trading floor and gaslight men who are taking it. So there's a culture that exists, right, that disincentivizes men, to basically take on this work. 'Cause people always say to me, Reshma, what do you do about the dads? I'm like, the dads are with me. They're not my problem. Like they want the same world that I want. It's just we live in a culture where we actually don't give men the opportunity to actually care equally.
Yeah, and I'd also argue that so many CEOs of the household name companies suffer from confirmation bias. They got to be the CEO through a certain path, and they expect other people to do that. Even ones that we admire. You mentioned the debt ceiling crisis that we're going through now as we're talking. Jamie Dimon always comes front and center. I've interviewed Jamie several times when I was at the New York Times, but I look at what he's doing now, and he's ordering all managing directors back in the office and saying he wants them there 5 days a week, and he wants them to be available to have impromptu meetings with junior colleagues. And I think to myself, that's total nonsense, because pre-pandemic, those managing directors, if they were in the office, they were losers. They should have been, they were traveling all over the place. They weren't getting promoted. They're traveling everywhere to clients. And which one of them is meeting, impromptu with the junior employee? It just doesn't happen. But my bigger concern is what it's actually doing is perpetuating this example that the only way you can get ahead is by being in the office. And if you're not
Yeah.
in the office, whether you're a man or a woman, there are plenty of the asset management division, Chase, they're both run by senior female executives. But if you're not in the office, you can't do it. How do we work to change that narrative and show that, there are plenty of 20 somethings and 30 somethings and 40 somethings who have found a way to work quite productively while still being, caregivers and human beings.
Well, I think that you need to have a movement of men who are at JP Morgan standing up and saying, wait a minute here. Like, I think right now, if we're going to retain women and if we're going to have a goal of having, half of our managing directors be female, the vast majority of them are going to become mothers.
Mhm.
And so that period of time, I would argue, especially between 0 and 10, 0 and 8, you need that flexibility. And the evidence has shown, the data has shown that like offering flexibility, offering the ability to work remotely does not decrease productivity. So this isn't about productivity. It's not about outputs. It's not about how many widgets we're creating, right? It's really about the way we've done things, in an attachment to the way that it's been, that has always disincentivized women. I just gave the commencement speech at Yale Law School last week, and there's no better example of this than the law firms. Basically for the past 20 years, you've had more women graduate from law schools than men. Most, incoming classes at these major law firms, right, have more women than men. But you invariably, in that 5th, 6th year, see that drop off. And it's because women choose to have children. And it's not because they want to stay home, they want to work.
Yeah.
But there's no path for them because you're expected to be always in the office, always on, always available. And when you are caregiving and caretaking, especially for a young child, it's not possible, right? And we know that, and so that's what I think is very frustrating about this. And God, God blessed us with an opportunity for the past 2 years to say, let's give you a test to see how it's going to go, and it went great. But even so, right? The market was thriving, right? There was massive the Fed did studies showing remote work basically enhances productivity.
Yeah.
But still, right, we have this cultural bias, and I do think it is meant. It's so funny you mentioned Jamie Dimon. I always say he's my target, in meaning like he's the guy that I want to be my poster child for Moms First. Right, because if he doesn't about face,
you mean like one of those like old Western Most Wanted type posters with like a 10-gallon hat, or what are we talking about here?
No, what I mean by that is I want him to be on stage with me being like, yes, we need to support remote work and flexibility if we want to basically have gender equality. You know what I mean? If we want equity, like, and I was wrong.
Yeah.
Right? Like we need that. Like we need, and he's a great example of someone that people really look up to and admire. And in many ways has shifted, right, the entire landscape.
Yeah, I mean, he almost gives cover to CEOs at lesser firms. Say, well, it's Jamie Dimon.
And you've got Elon Musk talking how it's a moral hazard. Like, what are you talking about?
Yeah, I tell the story that my middle daughter, her best friend, both of her parents are oncologists at Memorial Sloan Kettering, and the dad is actually curing cancer. He's trying to cure this form of cancer. And during the pandemic, he started working from home because he could run all of his trials, run all of his labs from home. And I said, this man who is curing cancer, trying to cure cancer, is able to be involved in his son's life and his daughter's life. Anybody who works in financial services can certainly be more involved in caregiving.
Yeah.
But let's back up a second, because we're talking about, white collar knowledge workers who, should be able to work wherever they want. You started, Moms First, then called the Marshall Plans for Moms, thinking about, those moms of the girls that you were bringing through, Girls Who Code, moms who were, as you said, essential workers, frontline workers, doing the types of jobs that you can't do from, your apartment in New York or my home in Connecticut. How do we, help them? And how do we make sure that there isn't, greater equity for white collar workers, but, hourly wage workers and blue collar workers lose out in this?
Yeah, because so many of these parents over the past few years have gotten fired because of childcare disruption. Mm-hmm. Because for them, it's also about the fact of that if you work for a small business or if you work in a factory and your kid is sick, or your daycare center shut down that day because there's a COVID, epidemic, and you can't go to work, for many of them, they get fired. Right. And so like, to me, it's creating opportunities. One, I think, to make sure that we recognize that like childcare disruptions are invariably for women, it's a childcare and basically it's a necessity to work. And so we have to kind of change the culture around that and offer flexibility if a parent is late or can't show up because they have a caregiving responsibility. And that needs to be a shift. And then you're seeing companies like Walmart, I think, do really innovative things. I mean, one of the big things when you talk to salaried workers is that they basically imagine you're working, in retail at a store, and you show up for your shift and your shift's been canceled, and you have a child and you've already hired a babysitter,
Right.
you're now out money, right? And so even Walmart created an app that allowed people to kind of shift schedules with one another so you can have more predictability, right? Because that is what hourly workers want. They need
Mhm.
predictability in the way that salary workers need flexibility. Um, so again, how are we changing and shifting the system to make it possible, right, for everyone to be able to both be a caretaker and be able to put food on the table?
One of the things we've advocated for that was well received is something that we call care days. And they're apart from sick days, they're apart from personal days, they're sure as hell not vacation days. But it's essentially if a care emergency comes up, you can take a care day. And it's a light lift for companies that lifts a heavy burden off of families. But again, I see it working fairly easily with salaried workers. When I've talked to, CHROs, I did this one CHRO at a gigantic health company that everybody knows. It was an off the record conversation, said, look, it's pretty easy for us to figure out, a caregiving plan for our salaried workers. Because if one is out, somebody else can fill in. But for our hourly workers, if we give them those same benefits, we're paying double. We're essentially paying for that person to have that time off to be a mom or a dad, to be a human, but we have to pay twice because we have to replace it. How do we get past, something like that? Like the economic reality of a company that would like to do the right thing, but is stymied by what it sees as a cost.
I think the reality is we have to do the math. There's not enough data on this. And so one of the things that we're doing with our National Business Coalition for Childcare is we're actually tracking this cost savings, of offering childcare subsidies in workers who don't miss as much work, on lower rates of attrition. And I think when you'll do the math, right, you'll figure out that actually it behooves you to offer these types of benefits. When you offer that worker a care day, instead of leaving in less than 12 months, right, she's going to basically leave, in 4 years because
Right.
offered her, you've cared for her family. The cost of replacing a single employee on average is 20% of an annual salary. It's really expensive. And part of what's happening right now, it's funny, I was talking to someone about this yesterday, and we were saying, like, in this moment where, in the economy, you're having layoffs, there's like less of an incentive in thinking about how do you retain somebody or what type of benefits that you should be offering, because you feel like employers feel like it's a buyer's market. I can do whatever I want, and it's gonna, and before that it was, a moment where people were quitting all the time, right?
Yeah.
And like so the point is that things ebb and shift. And if you are a smart employer, you're going to recognize that, and you're going to say, I want to create an environment where I can actually retain people as long as I possibly can,
Mhm.
because talent is hard to get and it's expensive to replace. And what are the benefits? You know what I mean? What that I can offer to basically make that happen. And invariably, as we've done our own kind of studies, it's childcare, it's paid leave.
Yeah.
People care about how you take care of them, their families, how you value them. And that matters to people.
When you think I'm wired to be an optimistic guy and a hopeful guy, when you look past, back on the past, 3 years, almost 3 years, what do you see as some signposts to progress, or some indicators that, even if we're taking a step back every so often, that we're generally moving forward when it comes to caregiving for both working moms and working dads?
Well, I think we've taken the conversation from the margins to the mainstream.
Hmm. Yeah.
The fact that we've launched a national business coalition on childcare, and that we have 40 plus companies, and we're doing, pretty big events, with pretty big leaders in the government, across the country, in the world, means the conversation is expanding. I'm leading the Care Council for Davos, again, which is a sign, what I mean, that business leaders I know that they have to have this that the care crisis basically is a huge innovation issue, and that we need to basically think about what real solutions are. I mean, the fact that we were able to launch a bipartisan childcare coalition, with Republicans and Democrats, showing that there are people who want to work together to figure out how to fix this, I think are all good bellwethers. The fact that our community of moms, that moms, we're at 750,000 moms, almost at 1 million.
Mm.
shows that like even though this is something we've all and not just moms and allies,
Yeah.
shows that like this is not something that these problems are not new, but this sense of that like I'm mad about it and I'm hopeful that we can do something about it. Pass me the ball.
Right. As
Is-
opposed to I'm mad about it and I'm just going to accept it because
And
this is what it is.
I'm gonna
Yeah.
complain. And it's funny, and it's so funny, Paul, because like as I'm going around the country, I'm having dinners, I'm like talking to people about it. And it was a very senior woman in finance that to me, Rush, when you first came talk to me, when you left, I was like, what is she talking about? And then I was sitting in the shower and I was like, oh, because oftentimes these are conversations that we've had with our girlfriends during drinks,
Mhm.
right? And now that has taken it from the private conversations we've been having to a conversation in the public arena about what is possible. And so it's just taking a minute for people to get their head around that. In many ways, it's like climate, right? 30 years ago, when you said to people, we have to recycle, they're like, you're crazy. That's too expensive. I'm not going to do that. Now it's like, because we've figured out that it is an economic issue, the growing, the entire kind of industry on care is massive. Famtech and what's going to be happening in companies that are figuring out how to disrupt childcare. You know what I mean? How to disrupt, you know what I mean? How to help companies offer these kinds of benefits, package them together. I mean, it's happening, right? And there's real cost savings, around a lot of these policies. And it's going to allow us to get to, I think, a fully functioning workforce that is able to function at its fullest capacity. We leave far too much talent sitting around the
Yeah.
table because we're refusing to solve this problem.
A couple months ago, we had Congressman Jimmy Gomez on our podcast. And for listeners, he is the congressman from Los Angeles who famously voted with his son, Hodge, sort of strapped to him in a little baby Bjorn. And I'm sure you know this story, Reshma, but it wasn't a stunt. It was a practical thing that he had to do because his wife at the time was the deputy mayor of Los Angeles, and the election of the Speaker of the House took so damn long that she had to fly home. She had to go back to work,
Yeah.
as people do. They're
Yep.
dual income working family, and he took Hodge onto the floor and voted again. And there are a couple other congressmen had their kids, and it was a sweet moment, and it led to him being, really elevating his own status and being one of the founders of the Congressional Dads, caucus. But he was very humble about it. He got a lot of credit for doing something that
That we do all the time.
exactly. And AOC came up to him, and there's sweet photos of them and offered babies. But had it been the reverse, nobody would have cared, or that mom would have been criticized. So, but he did it for a very practical reason. He had somebody to take care of his son. My question is, when men want to be, when working dads, what we call lead dads, when they want to be allies of, working moms, what are some tips that you give them? What are the best ways to go about it? Believing that they want to do the right thing, and perhaps they may have some blind spots, but what would you tell them as the best ways to be true allies of working
Well, I
moms?
think it's always about recognize the power of your situation. So I love the fact that Jimmy acknowledged that if he was a mom, it would have been a non-moment.
Mhm.
But that the fact that but he took that and he built something with it to elevate, you know what I mean, conversations and policy around paid leave and affordable childcare. So I think that that's great. So I think in many ways what men need to do is step into their power and lead on these issues. So if you think about at work, this happened with IVF. Many companies didn't offer IVF, but then women were like, what's your fertility benefits? But then men were like, what's your fertility benefits?
Mhm.
And you saw a sea change. So you want men to go in and say, what are your paid leave benefits? What are your childcare benefits?
Yeah.
Because they have less at stake, than we do. I think secondly, I think it's like, when I launched Marshall Plan for Moms, I had all these like Steph Curry, all these like sports leaders who came around and signed basically a petition that said, yes, mothers don't work for free, because so many of them had single moms, and they recognize that it's not about caregiving. It's about who's doing the caregiving. When I started Moms First, they're like, what about the dads? I was like, well, what about the dads? Because this is a perfect example. When you see dads doing caregiving work, they say, great job. My
Oh
husband
yeah.
was out with my sons, you know what I mean? Feeding them a bagel on the street. The amount of people that will stop and be like, oh my God, so sweet. No
Look
one
at
said anything to me. You know
you
what I mean?
even put the cream cheese on it. You're a genius. How did
You
you
are
do
a
that?
great
How it
dad.
was amazing.
And so we have to sit with ourselves a little bit and say, well, what is that about? What really is that about? And so I think our wanting to basically rally around parenting, rally around caregiving is not actually going to get to the crux of the problem. Is we have a problem with moms. Why?
Mhm.
You know, and so, and I think the second piece of this, which I think is really important, is we have to, as a society, change the division of labor at home.
Sure.
And we have to really, and my husband and I are perpetual, you know what I mean, couples counseling on this stuff, you know, because, and I married a great dad. My husband's amazing, but I took paid leave and he didn't. And suddenly I
Right.
knew where all the stuff was and he didn't. And we've never been able to get the ratio right. So it's constant, you know, it's constant work,
But
you
yeah,
know.
come on. We have a mutual friend in Eve Brodsky. You can go to Eve. She'll
Yeah,
send you a deck of the fair
a
play
deck of
cards.
cards
Deck
and
of
we'll be
cards.
fixed.
You'll sort it out.
And we'll be fixed. And it, no, but I think part of it is having the conversation without it leading to a tit for tat or a but I did
Yeah.
this or a, you know, blah 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 blah. And I do think that but I think the unpaid, and this is why I think companies can do an enormous amount by simply having gender neutral paid leave, making sure that men take it, incentivizing bonuses around it,
Yeah.
incentivizing pay around it, talking about it, parenting out loud about it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Really making it a company goal, right? And so there's real, I think, cultural changes that have to be made.
This has been wonderful, Reshma. Thank you. One last question here, though. I think about this, and I agree with everything you said. But that is sort of change coming from the top in a way. And I always advocate that change starts in the middle. But I look at the employee resource groups known as ERGs. Those parenting groups are 95% moms, and the 5% of dads who are there don't really need to be there because they already get it and they're already doing it. But I had a conversation with a gigantic life insurance company, and it went really well about stuff that we could do with them. But they came back and they said, you know what, we like this idea. We're going to have to kick it down the road for getting dads more involved and helping dads. Because if you help dads at work, you then start to remove the stigma around all caregiving being
Yeah.
the fault, the falls to working moms. We have to focus more on our working moms in our parenting group. And I went back to him and I said, look, this is your prerogative. You can do whatever the hell you want. But the reality is, if you keep those parenting groups just filled with moms, you're not going to get that full buy-in. And I know from the research we've done that there are men in their 20s, 30s, and early 40s who really want to be
Yeah.
involved. And so how do we, change that dynamic? Not at the policy level. Okay, here's your 20 weeks, take it or else. You can do that. But in the organic,
I think
culture of a company level.
I think you have more organizations like yours. I think you do have dads groups.
Mhm.
I think you do basically organize, and we think about like campaigns that we're going to be running, and we'll work with you on them about kind of centering men in care work. You know what I mean, and showcasing it, and rallying around identity. Look, I bet you that same organization went and told the moms that they're focusing on dads. I mean, I just think that right now none of this is really a priority. You know what I mean, and it needs to be, and I think it needs to be a priority by us demanding it inside of workplaces and saying, these are the types of supports that I want. This is the type of organizing I want. This is the type of conversations that I want. I mean, I'll say this as an activist working mom, I would love to see dads organizations in every company. Love it.
That's where we're going to end. That's a great way to end. Reshma Saujani, founder of Moms First. Thank you for being my guest.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Company of Dads podcast. I also want to thank the people who make this podcast and everything else that we do at the Company of Dads possible. Helder Mira, who is our audio producer. Lindsay Decker, who handles all of our social media. Terry Brennan, who's helping us with the newsletter and audience acquisition. Emily Servin, who is our web maestro. And of course, Evan Roosevelt, who is working side by side with me in many of the things that we do here at the Company of Dads. It's a great team, and we're just trying to bring you the best in fatherhood. Remember, the one-stop shop for everything is our newsletter, The Dad. Sign up at thecompanyofdads.com/thedad. Thank you again for listening.